probably familiar and probably would be buzzwords that you currently are working on or working with, that you're very comfortable with. Others, however, may seem really foreign and strange, and you wonder what does that mean? And I think this is just inherent in the challenge that we face, because there are so many different ways of framing this, so many different entry points. Some people come from more of a technical and engineering background and think in terms of plant eco-efficiency, and others come, more from an environmental background. Still others from a product development and design perspective. Still others from a social point of view. So the fact that there are so many buzzwords is a huge challenge and also a huge opportunity. So what I'd like to do is spend the time we have together today to develop kind of a common framework. And Kirti referred already in the introduction to this idea of the sustainable value framework. And that's what I'd like to spend some time developing with you today. And in my mind, what it provides is a strategy framework. It's a framework for thinking about how the challenge of global sustainability can be defined in business terms, business and strategy terms, and how we can see the challenge of sustainability having the prospect of driving value within companies. Because without that, I think we don't really get a lot of traction. So that's the purpose of the presentation today. So I start with a very, very simple-minded shareholder value framework. I know that the whole concept that shareholder value is the appropriate metric for corporate success is under fire these days. That has great controversy in and of itself, especially the idea of short-term, stock price. But I think most of us would agree that, at least for publicly held companies, driving shareholder value over the long term, right? Long-term shareholder value creation is a very important thing. Sustained long-term shareholder value creation, not short-termism, not dynamite fishing to drive up the value, in the next quarter for to sell the company, but long-term value creation is an appropriate metric. And for this, I'll build a very simple-minded shareholder value framework that draws heavily on Bob Kaplan's work on balanced scorecard, for those of you that know it. And let me just briefly describe this before we apply the sustainability angle to it. So I start with the premise that in order to drive long-term value, there are some competing demands. And on the vertical axis, you can see there are a set of pretty obvious dimensions, a dimension that has, kind of that anchors two ends of this dimension. Pretty obvious that to be effective, you have to be good at today's incumbent business, obviously, managing today's business effectively. But at the same time, you have to build tomorrow's opportunity. Now, many would say this is a time dimension, that it's about today's business and tomorrow's opportunity. But I want to begin with the caveat that this is really not about acting today and then sometime in the future. This is about acting simultaneously, about managing today's business effectively and also building tomorrow's opportunity at the same time. You can't do one and then the other in the future. Companies that do that typically get dead. It's important to actually be doing both of these things simultaneously. And herein lies the rub, because they're paradoxical. They require different skills and, in fact, compete with each other, and frequently do within companies. So the first, the vertical axis then has to do with this issue of today's business and tomorrow's opportunity. The horizontal axis has more to do with where activity takes place within the firm. On the left-hand side, you can see there are a set of issues, a set of challenges that have to do with nurturing the capabilities of the company. This is obvious that in order to be successful, companies have to build skills, technologies, develop technologies, build competencies and capabilities, build execution routines in order to really deliver, right? So building internal capability is fundamentally important, both for managing today's business, but also the capabilities to develop and begin to look at prospects for the future. But over on the right-hand side, there's a competing set, again, a paradoxical set of expectations which have to do with engaging external constituencies. If you seal off from the world and focus only on developing internal capabilities, you may become very good at them, but you also may become almost entirely irrelevant to the world. Or, you know, the world may become hostile toward what you're doing, and you may not be very much aware of it. So these two things also are somewhat paradoxical, because you have to be open to external views and constituencies while simultaneously building the execution skills and capabilities to deliver. And this translates then into 4 quadrants, and that are necessary in order to drive value. The first one is obvious, right? That in the lower left, it's all about reducing cost and reducing risk. This is what we typically hear about. This is sort of quarterly earnings, making sure that we're able to execute in today's business and to have the capabilities to do so to drive down cost and risk. That's important, right? But we also know in today's business, from the external point of view, that it's crucially important to be viewed as reputable, as legitimate with external constituencies. We can point to a number of companies these days, like in the U.S., companies like Enron and WorldCom, which were highly efficient in terms of capabilities, but became viewed as hostile to the world and were taken down by external constituencies. So reputation, legitimacy is also crucially important to driving value on a long-term basis. But these two relate primarily to the existing business, the incumbent business. It's also really important to be building new skills, new capabilities that will enable you to reposition for the future. Simply perfecting today's competencies, today's execution skills in today's business will eventually, if that's all you do, drive you into the ground. Because the world changes, nothing lasts forever. It's necessary to be acquiring new skills and technologies and capabilities so as to be repositioned effectively over time, right? So there are a set of internal capabilities that have to do with repositioning and the acquisition of new skills that are important to continuing value creation. And then finally, in the upper right box, you have to have a convincing story about how you're going to grow the firm. If all you do is execute efficiently in the current market, in the current business, again, eventually that runs out of gas. It's necessary to be thinking about what are tomorrow's opportunities and to have a convincing strategy of how you're going to grow the firm. What's the growth path and trajectory for the firm? We can point to a number of cases of companies that have done well in terms of cost reduction, risk reduction, are very legitimate with stakeholders, may even have wonderful R&D programs and alliances for future positioning, but don't have a compelling story or a strategy or thought of how they're going to grow the firm. What's the pathway to the future? And stock price tends to remain flat. So I begin with the premise that executing in all 4 of these quadrants is crucially important to driving value in the long term. I don't think this is at all controversial. Again, I think this is just a 2x2 matrix form of the balanced scorecard that Bob Kaplan and others have developed over the past couple of decades. But I think it's an important starting point, because unless we can agree on what the objective function is, then it's hard to see or hard to have a coherent discussion about how sustainability can come into play. So if we begin with this as the kind of base model, right, that, and you can see it here in this slide, that we have the 4 kind of performance dimensions that are important to driving shareholder value now in each one of these quadrants. Now we can add the challenge of global sustainability to the mix. And the way I'll do that is to take that long list of buzzwords that I showed you previously and sort them, basically, do a bit of a Q sort into the 4 quadrants. Because when you take all of those confusing terms and sort them, they begin to make some sense. And if we start in the lower left quadrant, you'll see those terms that relate to cost and risk reduction, those that have to do with today's business, managing kind of the internal skills and capabilities to be more efficient and effective in today's business. And these are things like waste reduction, emission reduction, eco-efficiency, environmental management, resource productivity. Again, I would say this set of buzzwords is probably pretty obvious to most people. Most large companies in the world, including India, have discovered that this is a productive pathway over the past 10 or 15 or 20 years. Certainly lots of small and medium-sized enterprises have yet to get on, on this path, but I think this is a pretty well-developed strategy at this point. I'll call it pollution prevention, and it's simply premised on the insight that if you're going to pay money for raw materials and energy as inputs to whatever it is the firm does, that you're better off driving as much of that into products that you can sell as possible versus pouring it out of smokestacks and out of outfall pipes out into the environment. That's really just wasting money when you come right down to it. And I would say the big insight over the last 20 years that initially put this notion of sustainability on the map is this core insight that you can reduce costs, you can reduce risk if you acquire the internal skills within the firm, usually within plants and facilities, to actually reduce the emissions of waste. And this takes new skills by employees. It requires empowering employees. It draws heavily on the skills of quality management and continuous improvement. But I think that this strategy has been pretty well proven over the last 20 years. So I won't spend a whole lot more time on it here today because I think this is quite well established. Again, we can choose to call it whatever we like, but I'll use the term pollution prevention as kind of the generic term for this strategy. And I would call this is one of 4 generic sustainability strategies in my mind. And the way that it drives value is by driving down cost and risk. If in fact the firm develops a core skill in this, then that's the result, right? And it can be a very immediate result. This can, projects in eco-efficiency can drive down costs in the current year even, but typically have 2 or 3 year payoffs. Now that's changing, right? As companies have spent more and more time and energy on eco-efficiency and pollution prevention over the last decade or two, all of the easy low-hanging fruit initiatives have typically already been done. Now it becomes increasingly difficult. The returns are perhaps a little bit diminishing, and continuing to be able to get the kind of short paybacks isn't as easy, and that's caused companies now to look more broadly beyond just eco-efficiency for opportunities in the sustainability space. And this is where the next quadrant comes in, and you can see the collection of buzzwords here is a little more complex. This would include things like life cycle management and green design, design for environment, engaging stakeholders, thinking about corporate citizenship, product take back, how do we, bring products back and reuse or recycle, full cost accounting, and thinking about transparency in general. Now, this set of buzzwords obviously is quite different from the lower left quadrant. The lower left quadrant deals entirely with the firm's plants or facilities. That's why it's internal, right? The firm controls everything that goes on in the pollution prevention quadrant, has complete control over how they manage their own facilities, which is probably one of the reasons why this has taken root first. In this lower right quadrant, by definition, because it deals more with external constituencies, this is more complicated, right? Because now it's necessary to think upstream. Where do the raw materials come from? All the way to the point at which they may be harvested from the earth or mined from the earth. What are the impacts associated with that? And all the way downstream. If you're a B2B company, you may be selling to another company, but eventually what you're doing is used by a consumer or an end user. What happens to that product, if there is a product, a physical product, at the end of its useful life? Where does it go? and how is that whole process managed? So and that's why the idea of stakeholder engagement and stakeholder management becomes so important, because now suddenly it's necessary to engage people and perspectives and constituency groups, including suppliers and customers, but a range of others, right, who are external to the firm in the process of managing this whole system. You know, this is really the entire product system. And we'll think of this strategy, the label we'll give is product stewardship, right? That this really is the, I'll use this as sort of the dominant term for this strategy. Now, product stewardship as a strategy, I would say, began 10, 15 years back in earnest, and its first incarnation, it was the term, you know, I think the term that we would associate it with this is the term green product, right? And like most terms in this space, the term green product carries a lot of baggage with it. As most of you would probably agree, if you think about it, what first comes to mind when you think about green products are, you know, typically they're more expensive, right? I mean, that's what we typically associated with the idea of a green product, that it's going to cost us more, and that oftentimes a green product may not work as well, but we're gonna be convinced to buy it because it's better for the world, right? That it contains recycled content or somehow it has social value. And if I think in my own experience, what was my first experience with the purchase of a green product? I go back to the 1990s, and the first green product that I can recall was recycled toilet paper here in the U.S., right? And I still remember going to the store, seeing all the conventional virgin toilet paper on the shelf, and then a few new choices of recycled toilet paper, and looking at the price, it was more expensive. When I got home and used it, I realized it didn't work as well, and I was not compelled to buy it after that. I think that this early experience with green products as costing more and perhaps not working as well has kind of fixed our mindset that anything having to do with green is going to be more expensive. I think this is a stereotype that we have to bust. This is a mindset that somehow we have to overcome, because it's really held us back, I'd say, on the sustainability front. The reason pollution prevention has gotten traction is because from the beginning it was seen as a strategy that could reduce cost and risk, whereas green products or product stewardship, I think, were positioned as more expensive. Now that's changing. What we see now are companies beginning to take this much more seriously, because any company can just lob recycled content into their product, lower its quality, and then try to charge a premium. That takes no skill whatsoever. But to do product stewardship effectively, it has to actually somehow either improve the product and its functionality, right, or even make it more affordable. And this can help not only drive legitimacy, but also build reputation, can differentiate, you know, the firm if you do product stewardship well. And let me bring one example to this, which I think is pretty compelling. It's a company that I'm doing a fair amount of work with these days, based here in the U.S., a company that probably no one has heard of, although you may have, because it's actually owned by an Indian business house. And the company is Novelis, N-O-V-E-L-I-S. It is a rolled aluminum company. Novelis is owned by the Aditya Birla Group, right, and Hindalco, right, which is the Indian aluminum company. Novelis is quite unique, however, because starting about 8 or 9 years ago, when Alcan was broken up, some of you may know the firm Alcan. You know, it was one of the big aluminum players, like Alcoa, right? But Alcan was demerged back in 2005 or 2006, and the upstream piece of it, right, the mining assets, were put into a separate company, and that was where the value presumably was. And those mining assets were bought by Rio Tinto, the mining company Rio Tinto. The downstream part of Alcan, all of the rolling mills and the marketing and customer-facing part of it, was put into a second company. And this company was viewed as sort of the waste product of the demerger, And this is what became Novellus. So nobody really thought much of Novellus initially. They saw it as kind of the waste product of the demerger. But as it turns out, Novellus has a huge value proposition. The Aditya Birla Group bought it, had the vision to see that by providing patient capital, it was possible to actually develop a very unique strategy. They brought in a CEO who had come from the Ford Motor Company who had quite a compelling vision. And today, Novellus is well on the path to turning the company into the world's first closed-loop aluminum company. In other words, to divorce themselves from the mining of bauxite entirely, or almost entirely, and to make new rolled aluminum for beverage cans, for automobiles, for electronics, for buildings, to make this aluminum out of scrap, almost entirely. When they started, they were about 25% recycled content, mostly with beverage cans. Today, they're over 50, and their 2020 goal is to be over 80% recycled content. Now, this is an audacious strategy, right? Because scrap aluminum today not only is cheaper than mined bauxite-based prime aluminum, but also uses 95% less energy and emits 95% fewer greenhouse gas emissions. So this is like the gold standard of product stewardship, because not only can you dramatically reduce negative impact, but you also have a lower cost at the same time. As Novellus pursues this strategy, they put intense pressure on their competitors. Some of the world's first all-aluminum vehicles, like, for example, Jaguar, owned by the Tatas, have set the tone. But now we see a lot of the other big mainstream companies, like Ford, has now come with their F-150 truck, be the first all-aluminum truck, which drops the weight by 1,000 pounds, increases fuel efficiency dramatically, and actually doesn't increase the price or the cost of producing the vehicle very much at all. So Novellus is investing large amounts of money in this recycling capability. We'll have to develop the world's largest and most complex take-back infrastructure ever known, including getting down on the ground in the developing world with street collectors and waste pickers in order to do so, because you need aluminum from everywhere in order to pull this off. But if they're successful, they will not only dramatically reduce their environmental footprint, but will also put themselves in an advantage cost position and build a reputation that will be difficult to duplicate. I think you can see that this strategy of product stewardship takes a fair amount of vision, investment, and is quite audacious. It's not like recycled toilet paper. To me, this is the future of product stewardship. And when you think about this strategy, it begins to bump up pretty closely against this next set of buzzwords and the next strategy that I want to talk about. And you'll see why I say that in a moment. And that's moving to the upper left quadrant. The reason that it's in the upper left quadrant is because it requires significant new capability development, right? And doing recycled toilet paper doesn't require much new capability development. It's primarily for external consumption. But to do this, to really do kind of leapfrog innovation that's going to dramatically reduce impact requires new capability development. So you see a whole set of different buzzwords. Eco-effectiveness versus eco-efficiency. Some of you may know this. This is a Bill McDonough term, right? And it stands in stark contrast to the lower left quadrant of eco-efficiency. Because as Bill McDonough is famous for saying, the lower left quadrant and eco-efficiency or pollution prevention, that's all about being less bad, right? Incrementally reducing negative impact in today's products or in today's process. Whereas the upper left quadrant is about getting to next generation technology that is actually more good, right? That may even be restorative as opposed to just incrementally reducing negative impact. It may draw from nature. This is the idea of biomimicry, that we can learn from nature in both product and process development. You know, examples, things like Velcro as a way of attaching things. You know, many of you may have clothing that uses Velcro. Well, Velcro is nature's way of attaching things together. You know, you don't find bolts and screws in nature, right? Velcro is nature's way of attaching things. And so the more we can learn from nature and become biomimetic, the more we can dramatically reduce negative impact and maybe even think in terms of restoration. Right? So DuPont, for example, over the last decade has spent considerable time looking at biomimicry. People like Janine Benyus, one of the kind of notable champions of this. In the early going back 10, 15 years, DuPont, which is in the Kevlar business, right? Kevlar is the material used in bulletproof vests, realized that that material was difficult to manufacture and produce, had some negative consequences, and they were quite impressed by the material that spiders produce when they weave their web. As it turns out, the spider web material, pound for pound, is stronger than Kevlar. And but if DuPont looks at the spider as the production plant, you realize that spiders don't have to elevate the temperature to 400 degrees and produce toxics in order to weave their web. And so this is where we can learn, right? How do we produce materials of that quality that can be produced in natural ways without the kinds of impacts associated with production processes from the past. So these are leapfrog technologies. These are sustainable technologies and you can see where the Novellus closed-loop aluminum starts to border on the idea of cradle to cradle, where you can completely close loops, because aluminum can go back to aluminum forever, right? It's an element. It's not degraded every time it's brought back and recycled. That cycle can continue forever. And we may even be able to think in terms of restoration, right? So even right there in India, you think about a company like ITC, right, which has, everyone knows about Ichopal, but may know less about some of their interesting strategies in the pulp and paper business, where over the last decade or more, they've worked with communities in rural areas where wastelands have become a real problem in India, to reforest wastelands. And they've worked, essentially training people to become microforesters, to replant areas, and in the process, they've been able then to sustainably harvest, gain access to an affordable source of fiber for their pulp mills, and have even developed a biopulping technology which can be applied locally. In other words, not always hauling raw logs with all the water content to pulp mills, and adding a lot more value locally, which builds livelihoods in the villages, but also gives them access to a very high quality, affordable biomaterial to make paper out of. And in the process, they're, over time, beginning to rebuild soil. And in some communities, they've actually been able to begin farming again, right? So the idea of restoration, that you can actually construct strategies that are restorative and have them compete, is a really important element of this upper left quadrant. And I'll call this upper left quadrant clean technology, realizing that this too is a buzzword, right? That there's been a clean technology revolution going on, we're told, and there has, right, over the last decade or so. The problem is that this term clean technology gets overused. If you look at a lot of the clean tech funds that are out there, you'll discover that many of them really are about pollution prevention and eco-efficiency. They're not so much about the kind of leapfrogging that I'm talking about here. And I think that's an important distinction to make. Let me give one example that maybe brings this to life. Many of you probably dry clean your clothes, right? Like if you send your shirts to the dry cleaner, you realize that dry cleaning is very toxic, right? That the chemical used in conventional dry cleaning is perchloroethylene. And this is a toxic substance. And almost everywhere in the world, in service industries, we've seen consolidation, but not in dry cleaning. Dry cleaning is still very much a mom and pop operation everywhere in the world, including here in the US. And it's mainly because nobody really wants to own a lot of toxic sites if they can help it. So in the existing dry cleaning industry, the sustainability strategy that's been used has been the lower left quadrant. In other words, how can we reduce the use of PERC use it more efficiently, use less of it in order to achieve our ends. That's pollution prevention. But we've seen, again, over the last 10 years or so, a whole host of new ventures, new technologies that are alternatives to perchloroethylene-based dry cleaning. One in particular that's quite interesting uses liquid carbon dioxide. When you put carbon dioxide under pressure, it turns to a liquid, and there's a whole suite of new soaps and surfactants that work especially well in a liquid carbon dioxide environment. And several companies, now have created cleaning technologies, clothes cleaning and other types of cleaning, including making microchips differently without using water, right? Can be done in liquid CO2. But in dry cleaning, there are several companies now that use liquid CO2-based cleaning technology where the clothes can be put under pressure, wash the clothes, take the pressure off. No energy is needed to dry the clothes because the CO2 just turns to a gas and returns to the tank. The soil is separated from the soaps, and the soaps are reused. New ventures have been started using this technology. Much safer workplace. You don't have the toxics present. You can bring this in at a comparable price point, and faced with the choice, most users would choose that over conventional dry cleaning. My prediction is that within a decade or so, conventional dry cleaning will all but become obsolete. It will be creatively destroyed. And this is the difference in my mind between a strategy of clean technology versus a strategy of eco-efficiency. So you can see where two people sitting at a table having a conversation about business and sustainability, and one of them means clean technology and the other one means pollution prevention, these would be two entirely different conversations, and these people really can't talk to each other, right? Because the logic, the value logic for pollution prevention is reducing cost and risk, whereas the value for a clean technology strategy is all about innovation and repositioning. And it's important within existing firms that it be sold that way within the company, right? That is the value proposition. These are not the same things at all. Just like product stewardship has a different value proposition than pollution prevention. Again, I think that's why it's so important to be clear as we develop these kind of generic strategies for sustainability. Now, the ITC example I gave, I think, relates rather well to, and the boundaries between these four quadrants are somewhat permeable, as I've already indicated. I think it connects well to this final upper right quadrant that I'm going to describe. And here you see a set of buzzwords: sustainable development, pro-poor business, brownfield redevelopment, urban reinvestment. In other words, reclaiming areas that have been contaminated, for example. Inclusive capitalism, majority business, social entrepreneurship. Now here's a good buzzword: radical transactiveness. I'll take some responsibility for that. Or B to 4B, which means business to 4 billion. Now this set of buzzwords stands, I think, in distinct contrast to the lower right quadrant, product stewardship. Product stewardship looks at the entire life cycle of product systems, but it's focused on today's business, right? It's focused on the existing market. The upper right quadrant focuses on everything else, right? The upper right quadrant is all about the unserved, poorly served, underserved, or actively exploited people and places of the world, right? It is the majority of the world, right? It is the majority of Indian people and communities. We'll call this the base of the pyramid, or the bottom of the pyramid, right? And what we mean here are those who are not well served, poorly served, or even actively exploited, or they're the forgotten or contaminated places of the world. These are, in other words, places that most firms currently don't reach. These are the potential markets. These are the future markets. These are the future stakeholders. These are the fringe stakeholders. These are the players that companies traditionally have not really dealt with very much at all. But in order to get after a strategy that better serves and lifts the base of the pyramid, it becomes necessary to become radically transactive, meaning to actually consciously reach out and engage with fringe stakeholders that have not been part of the current value system of product stewardship. the core stakeholders around current products are different from those of prospective new unserved markets that need to be created at the base of the income pyramid. And the example I gave with ITC and their wasteland reforestation, to me it's an interesting, that is a base of the pyramid kind of strategy, right? It's reaching out to communities that they previously hadn't dealt with and engaging in a commercial set of opportunities that build livelihoods, but also create business opportunities for the firm itself. And I can give another example here in terms of base of the pyramid that connect environment together, right? Of course, everyone is familiar with microfinance and Professor Mohammed Yunus and the Grameen Bank and the explosion of the microfinance space, or perhaps the other notable kind of explosive growth base of the pyramid strategy over the last 10, 15 years has been mobile phones, right? And the proliferation of mobile phone service to the rural areas and further down the income pyramid. This has been a huge success story, right, in terms of serving the underserved or creating markets that didn't exist before. In other areas, we haven't yet seen as much success, right? If we think about clean water or affordable housing or renewable distributed power or inclusive health care, I mean, these are still strategies that are emerging. And of course, some of you may know I've been actively involved in India trying to start this new institute, as Kirti knows, called the Emergent Institute, that's focused very much on trying to develop strategies that can compete in this space, you know, that are viable commercial strategies, but that also lift the base of the pyramid and leapfrog us to environmental sustainability at the same time. I want to give one example here, and then I'll draw this presentation to a close, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions. But let me give one example here from China, which I think is very interesting, and it's a company we've spent some time working with and also trying to develop a case around. Just like in India, there are lots of really interesting base of the pyramid ventures happening in China that also connect to the clean tech agenda, right? And when I think about connecting clean tech and base of the pyramid together, this is the idea I think of in terms of the green leap, kind of taking the green leap. And let me give an example here. There's a company in China called Tsinghua Solar. Tsinghua Solar is a spin-off company from a major university in Beijing, Tsinghua University, that some of you may know, probably one of the most prestigious universities in China. And the engineering capability at Tsinghua is really quite strong. And some years back, probably now 15 years ago, Tsinghua scientists, engineers at Tsinghua developed a technology for glass vacuum tube solar hot water. In other words, making hot water using the sun to heat water, but rather than using flat photovoltaic panels, they use glass vacuum tubes. This is much lower cost, also much more environmentally sustainable from a product stewardship point of view. It uses glass, right, highly engineered glass, as opposed to a lot of rare metals and antifreeze and so forth associated with flat panel photovoltaic hot water systems. But like most what we might think of as green product or environmental entrepreneurs, when they first took this out, started the company called Tsinghua Solar, since they saw it as a green product, they were duped or brainwashed into thinking that that meant you had to sell it to the rich, right? That it was green products were for rich people, right? Going back to our earlier conversation about product stewardship. So when they launched Tsinghua Solar, their initial market focus was the high-end market in Beijing and Shanghai and other developed cities where there were people who they saw as being interested in environment and green products. Needless to say, this strategy really didn't work very well. It almost bankrupted the company. All of these people already had hot water and certainly weren't interested in having some rooftop, solar glass vacuum tube array. It was completely unnecessary and it almost bankrupted the company. Almost out of desperation, the people at Tsinghua were searching for other opportunities. They went out to the towns and the rural areas, realized there was huge pent-up demand, underserved, unserved need that many people in the towns and rural areas had only periodic, occasional access to hot water, maybe only to be able to bathe once a week. Huge needs, but this required them to optimize the actual artifact, the actual device, in different ways. They needed to reduce costs, take some of the high-end features out of it that they were trying to sell to the wealthy people in Beijing and Shanghai, and also develop a new business model which engaged the local people, involved them in the sale and service of this device, and create the necessary financing mechanism to make it possible for such people to acquire systems like this. And this is what allowed the business to really take off. The glass vacuum tube solar industry in China now has crossed the billion-dollar mark. It's exploded with growth in the last 5 or 10 years. Tsinghua Solar is growing at about 60% a year. They can barely keep up with demand just in China. We've had conversations with them about whether this is a strategy they see spreading to other parts of the world. They do. They're interested in that, but they're so busy just trying to keep up with demand in rural China that they haven't been able to devote the necessary attention to it at this point, although they would certainly see the technologies and business models like this coming to North Africa, coming to India, and then eventually, as it becomes so good, so affordable, so proven, and as fossil fuel prices eventually rise, we're seeing a decline right now as we sit here today, but over time, eventually fossil fuel prices will rise. As that happens, these systems like this, technologies like this, may have potential to trickle up, right, to the higher income space. This is what V.G. Govindarajan has been calling reverse innovation, right, that these technologies, these products, these business models could trickle up, could move up the income pyramid. And in my view, this is how the kinds of leapfrog innovations that will take us to a more sustainable future will actually come about, through this sort of Tsinghua Solar mode of leaping first to the base of the income pyramid with disruptive next-generation clean technologies, devising business models that serve and lift the underserved at the base of the pyramid, and then holding the prospect for trickling up over time. And so these strategies, base of the pyramid strategies, create new markets that didn't exist before, right? They're about tomorrow's technologies and markets and how to apply them and how to grow them. And they really, they define the future growth path and trajectory. This is where all the people are. This is where the remaining population growth is. This is where the big problems, societal problems, are. So these are hugely important sustainability strategies as we go forward. So let me pause there and just sort of summarize, right? If we think about the sustainable value framework, any existing company, any current corporation, you can chart your portfolio. You know, every company has its own portfolio, own sustainable value portfolio. And some strategies, some initiatives, and I would argue most in existing companies, relate to pollution prevention. It's about minimizing waste and emissions from current operations, and this can drive down cost and risk. That's the value driver. Right? And there are a set of drivers, there are a set of sustainability drivers for that. Next, strategies for product stewardship integrate stakeholder views into current product systems and business processes. And this is all about building reputation, legitimacy, and over time, differentiation, right? And there are a whole set of societal drivers for that as well. And if done well, this can really help establish, create a differentiated and legitimate position and build reputation for the firm. Next, strategies for clean technology are all about developing and deploying the sustainable competencies of the future. It's all about innovation, repositioning for the future, where the world is headed, and there are a whole set of societal drivers for this, right, that we've talked about. And then finally, strategies for the base of the pyramid are about co-creating new business models and new businesses to fulfill unmet needs out there in the world, in the underserved space. And this is all about growth and trajectory. This is where the future lies, and there are a whole set of societal drivers for this as well. And so these are the four, I would call them generic sustainability strategies. They're different from each other. They have different strategic logic, and each firm can sort of plot its own portfolio. I would encourage you to do so. As I work with companies over time, and you actually plot, you say, okay, where are the resources being spent today? Where are the initiatives that are occurring within the company? What's the head count devoted to each of these? What you would typically find is a very bottom-heavy portfolio. Most companies have the bulk of their sustainability money and investment in pollution prevention, some in product stewardship, maybe a little bit in clean tech, and almost nothing in base of the pyramid. I would argue that if we look over the next decade, right, if the last decade was all about the lower part of the framework, and the lower part of the framework is about incremental improvements to today's products and processes, then the next decade is going to be about creative destruction. It's going to be about creating tomorrow's technologies and new markets. That's where the future lies, in my view. And if I look at India, it's an exciting time. I think with the new CSR law, there are chances to take that CSR law and use the CSR law as a vehicle for driving experiments in the upper part of this matrix. Because this is where we can experiment with next generation leapfrog technologies and entirely new base of the pyramid strategies. So let me stop there. Let me pause there. I'm hoping that this has made sense, that it's given you a way of thinking about the connection between the challenges of sustainability and business strategy. And I'm happy to take some questions in any way that people would like to do that. So, Kirti, I'd like to turn it back to you at this point, if I could.
We are taking over from here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Yeah. Thank you, Stu, for this wonderful deliberation. I'm very hopeful that everybody must have enjoyed thoroughly, and we are immensely thankful for taking time out and doing it. And I must tell to all the participants that you must visit SBM Forum, the website, to know what kind of activities we are undertaking. We are currently doing a case study competition with professors. We are doing webinars, and we are going to have a roundtable in month of March. So a lot of activities around. So I would request everybody to really contribute to this whole journey, which we have started in India with the support of GIZ and many thought leaders. So we look forward to participation from all of you. Thank you, Stu, and thank you, everybody.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.